Tom, an alcoholic, member of the primary purpose group of AA in Southern Pines, North Carolina. And if my voice sounds different, it's because it is. I've got a little bronchial infection, and so if I stop in mid-stride, Sandy, it'll mean it's kicked in. And so we're well rehearsed enough that we'll just fall right in. You won't even know. You think I'm still up here. And I count it a pleasure to work with this guy. I don't know of anybody that's more steeped in knowledge and insight and ability to communicate what this program's about than my buddy. And so I'm just pleased to be here, pleased to be dealing with what we're dealing with. And I'll come close to what he said. I'll probably deviate a little bit. That's just the way drunks are, you know. I'm extremely well prepared. This is for show. It looks like a whole bunch of stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there, none of which has anything to do with what we're doing. At least not much, anyway. And my material is compliments of the Palmer House. So, how I want to approach what Sandy was talking about, I guess they kind of looked for one of the older dudes to talk about history. I'm working on my 49th year in the fellowship, and that they always figure they want to get you on before you check out because they know you're not going to be here too long. And that's why they put us on Friday. They didn't think we'd last. And yeah, I don't think there's any special knowledge that comes out of that kind of vintage, but it does cause some proximity. And that I'm one of the fortunate people still remaining on the planet who had the chance to meet and interact a little with Bill, our founder, and valued that. He valued that enormously, and knew a good many of the first 100 members. Yeah? And so it's a part of the legacy, and it sort of gives me a feel about history, if not an overwhelming knowledge. Now, how I want to, in all honesty, I'm not overly interested in the facts, the details of history. I'm interested in what happened, what happened. And whether it happened on Tuesday the 9th or 2 years later, I couldn't care less. I'm just grateful that it happened. So I'm not a technician on history. If you want to challenge me on any date, I probably won't mention any. I'll yield to whatever you think because I won't try to defend it. So what's important to me is where we came from. And I want to look at history from the standpoint of the developmental consideration of history. What was it in our history that shaped us to do things the way we do them? And so I just want to pick out a few highlights in walking through a bit of that. Most of it you'll be very familiar with. Although we didn't start with Ebby and Roland, it's the place where the visible identification of our roots came from those two guys and the experience that happened. And you remember that story that Ebby was the town clown up in Vermont, and they had him arrested for shooting birds or something in his house or whatever, doing something goofy, as usual. And they had him in court getting ready to lock him up, and Roland was a guy who had been struck sober by God after talking to a psychiatrist in Switzerland. Remember that? He went to this eminent guy in Switzerland, got struck bone dry. Unfortunately, it didn't stay that way. But he stayed that way long enough to do something with Ebby that I think formed some of the ethics of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so when he heard that his buddy Ebby was in trouble down at the courthouse, he went to the court and he petitioned the judge to let me have this guy. Let me try to do something with him. And so the judge was glad to turn him over to anybody that would just take him out of town. And so he gave him to Roland. And it's interesting to me that the trail that led to the formation of Alcoholics Anonymous you now see that in a whole different kind of stage, because we still do a lot of interaction with courts. But I'll come back to it and contrast what happened between Abby and the judge and Roland and what we do now. And what you'll observe is a 180-degree difference in it. And so, but that sort of laid the groundwork. And Abby got sober. And then, what that set up, I think the principle that came out of that was about active outreach and a thing we today call CPC, a cooperation with the professional community. And that's exactly what that was for the well-being of Abby. And so he wound up down in New York, sober, jumped into the Oxford group, got very active in that. And his friend from back home in Vermont, Bill Wilson, was living in New York. Abby made a call on him. He just called him up and said he wanted to come visit. And if you know the history, Bill was thrilled because he knew Abby would bring a jug. And to his dismay, Abby came in sober and acting weird. And Bill asked him what was wrong, and he said, "I got religion." Well, his thoughts of a drunken orgy were gone, and so he's sitting there with this fellow with the gleaming eyes. And well, if you ever saw Abby, I had the chance to meet him. Gleaming eyes is not the way to describe Abby. He looked like death warmed over, I swear to God. That's an ugly boy. But anyway, he's working on Bill, and he told Bill he got religion, and Bill got a little intrigued by it. Then he wound up stumbling in and out of the Oxford groups for a while, getting on, trying to savor that kind of religious nectar. But something happened when he met with Abby, because he met a guy who was like him, who didn't seem to be like him anymore. And that made an indelible impression on him, that there really was a way out of this thing. So he fumbled with it. And he didn't have much success. He was just drunk on an installment plan. And so he finally wound up on what turned out to be, I'll skip over a bunch of them, what turned out to be his last trip to Towns Hospital. And I want to underline the name William Silkworth. William Silkworth. Because for my money, William Silkworth could be named one of the third founders of this program, that his role was so important. And what happened to Bill, and I think everybody in AA is familiar with his experience, where he's gone through this thing, and he finally got to that point of utter desperation and cried out, "God, if there is a God, show yourself to me." And he had that well-known hot flash, that great white light, where he had that transforming experience, and he was to never be the same man again. And he went through that change, and for some reason, Sandy mentioned this earlier with he and I, he came out of that not only with restoration with his own problem, but with a zeal to help other alcoholics. And the reason I say that we ought to underline Silkworth was that what happened to Bill, I don't know, I've had things like that, seem like that, happen to me from drinking too much wine. And I just get really wild, crazy, and at no time, most of the time, put a net on me and lock me up somewhere. But with Bill, we were blessed with having a guy who had the insight and wisdom to say, "Hey, Bill, I don't know what happened, man, but you better keep it because it sure beats what you had." That was wonderful counsel into a region that we hadn't gone. And he was able to steady Bill and say, "Hang with it, hang with it." What a great example of CPC, eh? What a great example. For a guy to have enough insight to steady the guy and say, "Hang on, buddy, hang on." And then later, it was brave enough when it was totally unheard of to let a patient that's just barely sober come back into the hospital and carry the message. Well, we didn't have a message in, but to carry his experience to other patients. Wonderful thing. Now, when you look at the history, you see the powerful role that our friends outside had. Thank God for them. Because if it hadn't been, I doubt if we'd probably gone to the moon. But we had people, blessed with people, who held us steady while we kind of got things going. And so that beginning, and Bill had a real good experience with chasing drunks. Now, I'll just mention one thing about the lady that was to be formidable in Al-Anon. It's amazing how people are helpful to us more than they may realize. But if you remember when Bill was going through all this stuff and he had nothing but disappointment, failure, nobody staying sober, had somebody trying to commit suicide in the house, all this kind of stuff, just the typical mayhem of dealing with drunks. And he said to his wife one day, with total discouragement, this thing isn't working. Nobody is catching on. Nobody's getting straight. And Lois, Bill's wife, said something profoundly important. She said, yeah, Bill, you are. You are. And that set a principle that there's no such thing as an unsuccessful 12-step call. There's no such thing as an unsuccessful attempt to reach out to somebody else, because it's the reaching out to people that gives us what we need, that strengthens us. And so results are not what make that, it's effort. So that notion that we try to carry the message, and if we do it sincerely, we can't miss. And so Bill got through that period, and then he started to get a little bit of business back together. He was a sort of unsuccessful stockbroker with a lot of imagination. And he got a business opportunity, and he made that trip to not too far from here, to Akron, Ohio. And I think even in its heyday, Akron was a kind of a sad place, even when it was bustling. Man, it's really sad now. It's filled with empty buildings from where tire factories used to be. Bill went there, and he went on this venture, and he had this scheme of some way he was going to sell a bunch of stuff. And as sometimes happened, nothing worked out. Nothing worked out. And so here he is in a strange town, and he's run his course. You ever been there? Where you've just run your course and you can't think of any other angle to shoot. And that's where Bill was. And God knows I've been there many times. And I tell you this, I had an opportunity. I didn't have an opportunity. I made an opportunity. I was in Akron a while back, a few years back. And every time I go up there, I get somebody to take me on a historic tour. And it's just a marvelous experience to go back and revisit those places and just touch base with where we came from. And I always treasure that. I had never gone into the Mayflower, the hotel. And I'd always wanted to, but it had been converted from a hotel into some kind of a sheltered environment for a special population. I'm not sure who. And you got to respect their privacy. And so I never had gone in, but I was walking around one day with an enterprising drunk. He said, would you like to go into Mayflower? I said, yeah, but you can't do that. He said, watch this. And my kind of drunk. So he just waited until somebody came out, grabbed the door, and said, come on. So we're in. Then we walk in the hotel, and we're on what they call the lobby, but it's really the mezzanine. It's that second landing. And so I went up there with the guy, and you know how sometimes there's things that you just want to be private, that you don't want to talk about it, you just want to experience it and savor the experience. And without planning, I found myself standing there, and it's something about a bar. I don't care, you can make the Sistine Chapel out of it, it still looks like a bar. I mean, you don't have nobody has to tell you. You walk in there and say, man, this was a bar. And you just know it. It's that intuitive knowledge of the alcoholic. So I went in, and I knew that was the bar. And I was casing it, looking over, and I see over there where the phone was and is. And I'm sitting there, and that, virtual reality is what they call it now. But I was sitting there, kind of playing through my own mind. Now, I didn't have to use any imagination, because I've been to that point where I was down to my last shekel and totally out of plans and no earthly idea of what to do. And had been torn between either fighting again or giving up. And I always gave up. And so I'm sitting there, I just feel that. I started I walked through how I saw Bill's experience occurring. And I physically took the walk. I walked back and forth across that lobby. Didn't say anything to my buddy. But I'm just walking back and forth from the one side of that lobby to the other. And reliving how it feels to be standing on the brink of that and not wanting to do it. But I always did. Yeah. And he walked all over to the phone and made that historic phone call. I tell you what really impacted me that day was not only reliving the experience. It's like listening to a drunk tell his story. But I was listening to Bill's story in my own mind. And I'll tell you what struck me profoundly that day and does to this day was that I felt the full realization of what a tremendously critical juncture that was in our history. Because the destiny of every one of us hung directly on the actions that Bill Wilson took that day. We were hanging by an extremely slender thread. And thank God he made the right moves. If he'd have made the wrong move, we may still have a destiny to come, but it would have been different. It would have been different. But this guy, with the help of his God, went over, picked up the phone, called, made that historic phone call to this Reverend Tonk fella in Akron, and asked him that. It had to be a weird sounding question. I need a drunk. I need an alcoholic. Very few people order an alcoholic. I can imagine that. I just imagine that guy saying, "What'd you say?" but he would, again, we were fortunate that this guy seemed to have an inkling. He'd been involved with Oxford groups, and he had an inkling that what this call was about. And so he gave him a list of folk, and as everybody called, Bill called, was busy. How it is, a busy world. And then he got a gal by the name of Henrietta that on the phone that understood what he was talking about. That understood. She was a non-alcoholic, but she understood. And she said, "I think I know somebody." And she set up the meeting with Dr. Bowden. And that was a truly historic point in our history. Again, this powerful relationship with our friends that help us through the fog, so we can get steadied and get strong in what we're doing. And then that meeting with those two men, where they went in supposedly for 15 minutes and went about 6 hours. True alcoholics. His workshop will probably end about Saturday, 3 o'clock. But no, we'll be on time. But those two men met, and exactly what Sandy was talking about in that great opening. Something forged that day that is absolutely the most universally important thing in all of Alcoholics Anonymous. These two folks sat down, a discredited stockbroker and an old doc on his last legs, and they sat down, and Bill told him his story, told him about his condition. And here's a stockbroker explaining an illness to a physician. We didn't even call it an illness then, but he's explaining a condition. And the doc's reaction was, finally, somebody understands. And what happened that day, unlike with Ebby, that was a different level of thing. Here were two human beings connected at the fractured level, where they were broken. And these two guys, they had an identification. And my belief is that what formed that day was the basic tenet of Alcoholics Anonymous. The basic tenet. That just like Sandy was saying, everything we drew emanated from that. Everything that we do. grew out of that unique understanding that seemed to occur between those two guys. Powerful thing. I think, we do a lot of stuff. We just finished an international convention with many, many thousands of people there. But I think the most noble thing that we do, the greatest we ever are, is when one alcoholic sincerely opens up and shares with another. That's the most powerful thing. And so everything else sort of emanates out of that. And that form, that principle was formed that day in Alcoholics Anonymous. I tell you, I'll just throw this, and we may come back to it later, but I really believe that there's enormous influence that does and should come out of what happened with Bill and Bob. When you start thinking about, and I won't elaborate on here, but just maybe tease you a little bit with it. When you start thinking about things that are troubling to you in Alcoholics Anonymous, things that you worry about and wish were done differently, the basic measure of where it is in regard to that basic tenet. It either is congruent with that or it's moving away. And if it's moving away, it's moving into thin ice. And so I think it's fundamentally important, that piece of our history, defining who we are and putting a limit on how grandiose we get in our notions of who we are. And so tremendously important thing that happened that day. Then I've got North Carolina time. I don't have a clue what time it is. Is it 11?
It's an hour earlier.
Huh?
It's an hour earlier than that.
I appreciate that, Julia. One reason I'm in this shape today, I turned myself over to Julia and Phil yesterday and said, "Have your way with me." And they did. Man, we were in prison. Well, anyway. I was ready for bed last night. I'll put it that way. I won't rush this too much now, but we got about 100 years of stuff, not quite, but we've got a bunch of stuff to go. But I think you can sort of see where we're trying to get with this thing is what is it that forms us as we are, and then when we take a look at where we are today, are we where we say we want to be? Is the whole thrust of this thing. And so with what happened with those guys, they hung together, and then they found a third guy. And so the whole concept of each one reach one was born, and they started to move on, and they captured that drunk lawyer and brought him to submission, and then on and on. And there was a little gal in Akron and Cleveland who was, for me, somebody wrote a book about her a while back called it Sister Ignatia, Angel of Alcoholics Anonymous. If you haven't seen that book, it is a wonderful read. And I think it gave me an appreciation of the tremendous value of her role in the forming just the basic operational procedures that we do in AA. And her work with Dr. Bob and starting to get people into pay. Bob gets all the credit, but Sister Ignatia did all the work. She almost got defrocked by the Catholic Church because she was, well, that was a whole story by itself. Read the book. It's a great read. And but what a tremendous gal she is, or was. A great gal. And what a super contribution that gal lives on. I spoke at the Sister Ignatia banquet about a year or so ago down in Cleveland. She lives on in this program. And so tremendous, tremendous role. And what it set up, again, was that professional community meshing well with our efforts in AAs for a good outcome. I'll tell you one thing, it's funny how a legacy lives on. I have the opportunity to travel extensively all around the country. Akron, Ohio is the only place I know where the original hospital ethic is in place. They still do it like it was 1935. They got different language and stuff, but my God, they still do it just like they did in the old days. And that's the only place in the country that I know. So, huge contribution. A fellow by the name of Clarence Snyder emerged in that early influx of AAs, and Clarence Snyder was a guy. He had a little different drum beat, but he did some signal work in Alcoholics Anonymous that had profound impact. I think he was a guy that perfected the art of the 12-step call. And for my money, he influenced the development of sponsorship as well as anybody I know. He was a real driving, hard driving, crusading type of fella and did great work. He, by the way, is buried about 10 miles from my house. And never knew that. But anyway, I knew it now. I went to the funeral, so I knew where they buried him. I was there. He was a great contributor in those early days of formulating this thing. He never did give up on the notion that the General Service Office ought to be in his garage. But other than that, he was right off. We started to get a little bit of growth. Now, it doesn't take much growth for alcoholics to get grandiose. Can you imagine? There are more people. When we formed the notion of a worldwide movement, there are 3 times as many people in this room as there were in all of Alcoholics Anonymous. And these guys are taking on a worldwide movement. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if somebody said, I make a motion that we invade China or something? I mean, that sounds goofy now, but that's about what they were doing. These guys just had that crazy vision of doing something, and they were an interesting crowd. With all of that overwhelming success, they must have had 40, 50 members. They said, we need to write a book to tell the world about this thing so everybody will know to jump on the bandwagon. And so they wrote the book, like they killed each other doing it, but they wrote the book. Bill held the pen and they held his feet. And so they wrestled it together and produced the book out of that crowd. It's always struck me as just so typically alcoholic that you take off on this barnstorming deal, and they're barely out of the starting blocks, and here they go. Thank God for it. If it had been me, we'd probably had it in my backyard. But great deal. A thing that happened, and it's in line with that sort of grandiosity that was emerging in, was, folks always think you got to throw money at it to make it work right, that you got to have some money. I'm not one of them. I believe when it comes to this kind of work, when you put money in it, you suck the heart right out of it, is what happened. And that would have been true then, but if you probably remember that Rockefeller dinner, where they took advantage of some contacts, threw together a dinner. What they were going to do was bring in a lot of folks with deep pockets and say, we need some money, and leave there billionaires. That was the plan. And they put all this bunch together, put a drunk at each table. One of them at one table said the guy just got out of the nut house 2 or 3 days earlier, but they had him there to give credibility when they started talking about give us the money. And so they made the hit. Now, in the minds of us, those us of us who were there then, in our minds, these were noble things, that if we could get some money, we could do some stuff, and we could get the work done and all of this kind of stuff. And thank God for prudent friends with insight, because the Rockefeller bunch said very eloquently, don't you think money will louse this thing up? Profoundly important, because had it not been for that, we would have gone into the money business and it would have sucked the heart out of it, and I'll guarantee you we'd have had a different history. But thank God for those friends who said, don't screw it up, you got something good going. Made for some lean years, but it was tremendously important stuff. It was slow growth when you looked at it. We say 100, but that depended on what day you counted. Best I can tell, we never did get 100 steady soldiers, that in that first formative time. And so, but we were moving, had some vision, and something happened in the early. Well, a lot of stuff happened, but one I want to single out was that Jack Alexander thing. And what it did was, I think, demonstrated the value of public information, of letting people know that Alcoholics Anonymous is here, that there's a solution. Now, Jack Alexander wasn't the only one that did it, but for some reason, his article had more impact than all the others put together. But we started to get some recognition, probably beyond what we deserved, but we got a lot of it. We started getting written up in some magazines. And Jack Alexander wrote one. I guess one reason his had appeal was that he didn't write it till he attended enough meetings. The way he described it, that he'd never breathed so much smoke or drank so much heavily sugared coffee in his life. But when he was properly saturated with that stuff and with what he felt today, he was ready to write. And he wrote an article that had enormous impact. Now you picture this fledgling group of alcoholics bunched up in New York and Akron and Cleveland. And all at once, an article goes out saying, hey guys, there's help. And in no time at all, 8,000 screaming pleas for help. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine 1/3 of this group answering 8,000 calls from every corner of the country? That was the dilemma. That was the quandary. And just a whole bunch of stuff grew out of that. One, certainly the value of public information. God knows how much importance and impact that had. Tremendously important. The other thing was that we learned a lot of ways to carry the message. There's more than one way to do it. And when folks said, what are we going to do with all these things? The guy said, some of us travel. And when we travel, we'll carry the message. And between then, we'll write. And we'll get. And what happened, I tell you, it's the most moving part of the history to me, is I can picture. In fact, I held a flag in a place. But what happened was all around this country, somebody or some group of somebodies, usually somebody, would get the message and they would say, we'll do it here. Wherever that was, Yuma, Arizona, wherever. And somebody stuck the flag and said, we'll do it here. And we'll hold on till help comes. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah, I was in a town one time when there was some around there, but most of it was horizontal most of the time. So it was. I'm the only guy standing. And I tell you, when you're standing there holding that flag by yourself, it's a lonely vigil. And you appreciate it when the cavalry comes. I guarantee you that. So I really admire and respect those people. Somebody did in Chicago. Somebody told me who it was. But somebody, yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's the guy. Yeah, he held the flag. And then somebody came. And then before long, you got 800,000 groups. You got a lot of groups in Chicago. Know that. But somebody started that. Thank God for those folk. The huge influx in the world. My wonderful notes have just absolutely. It's 50 of something. Oh, that's the date, for God's sakes. That 50 was the date of our first international. And we bunched up in Cleveland. It bunched up in Cleveland. It brought in, back then it was essentially a business thing. We brought in delegates from around the country. And in 50, the traditions were introduced to the fellowship. And that was an important place where we started to build the future, where Bill had the foresight with the other guys to say, here's how this thing can work. And those were introduced. Knowing how we are, it gave 5 years to think about it before we made a decision. And then 5 years later, down in St. Louis at the Second International, the traditions were adopted. And very importantly, the fellowship was turned over to its members. There was no longer any sugar daddy taking care of business. That Bill became a member. Now, he was kind of an important member, and he was called on a lot. But the dynamics were put in place for us to become a fellowship that's grassroots driven. And something I hope we'll visit a little bit more. But the deal is, it's in our hands. And there's no longer any kind of a central leadership point. And the leadership will come from us all around the country. Very important place in our history where we had to take that thing and become responsible all across the board. The thing I think I want to wrap up around this is in talking about, I want to put just a general characterization. That part was sort of talking about how the fellowship developed, how we grew as a fellowship. During that time, one of the significant things about that segment of our history, up until, well, I came in 57, and certainly when I came in, it was still very much the case. Up, say 60s or somewhere like that. I promise you about dates, I don't have a clue. But we were basically characterized by extensive, intensive action. We were not a real thoughtful society that got off into retreats and studies and all this kind of stuff. There wasn't time. We were busy doing the work. And so you can imagine what folks who suddenly flooded with 8,000 requests for help, you imagine what their primary purpose was, can't you? One was to just sort of try to keep up, for God's sakes. Even when I came along, today I get a 12-step call once in a while. I've had 3 at the same time, different people. And I guarantee you that's fun when you get 3 brand new alcoholics in a car. And I put the one with 30 minutes sober looking after the one with 15 minutes. And I guarantee you it is fun. And so what characterized that was intensive activity. We did a lot of work one-on-one with 12-step calls. And the thing that the powerful principle that came out of that really governed how we functioned as a society for a long time, was that every one of us, you could pretty safely say, every one of us came in as a direct result of another alcoholic reaching out a hand and saying, hang on and come on with us. Very personal. Everybody had that kind of linkage to the heart of the fellowship. And so that really formed. What happens when somebody reaches in and pulls you out of whatever you're in? What's formed there is a loyalty second to none. Second to none. And that's why with no hesitation, somebody call you from the most ratty part of town, and you go without question and say, let's get it on. And so that was a very important principle, a very important ethic that developed in Alcoholics Anonymous at that time. It drove the service apparatus, It drove the service apparatus because that feeling of intense personal level connection was there. I'm emphasizing that a little bit because you'll find that to be quite changed today, I think. And it is one of the things that we ought to consider when we're thinking about what shapes us and what drives us and what we ought to be concerned about today. Well, Sandy, I think I've said enough about that. I read a lot of outside stuff too, and I'm just amazed how many of those folks have captured our AA philosophy and what they do. And I think it's a great question to ponder a little bit. And let me just offer this to you. I think one of the mistakes we often make is that we develop a program and then try to fit it in somewhere, which I think is 180 degrees off. And the best way to organize is to organize around a way to solve a problem. Organize that the committee exists to get a job done. And so it's easier to tackle a project, and then all you do is say, how do we need to organize to get this done? And so it'll take care of shaping the deal. And I say that for one other reason, that in doing service committees, and what I find is that there is at least as much, if not more, value in the preparation to do the project than there is in the project itself. There's something really, really importantly effective about this thing of getting the message ready to go. And what happens is it really energizes the committee. So 2 things. One would be to focus on the problem you want to solve, organize, get it done, and then you got a committee there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Kitty, visiting from Columbus, Ohio, Alcoholics Anonymous.
Hi, Chitty. Welcome.
For this workshop. Sandy and Tom, thanks so much. I'm really learning a lot. My head's spinning, so hopefully I get this question out of it. I love working with newcomers. It's just such a treat. And I learned something today. One of the many things is the business of that I am the business of treatment, and I don't know what to do. I'm having a very hard time carrying the message. The desperation isn't there because somebody's fixing the meals and they already are working a program, so they don't really depend upon AA. The sponsorship relationship is the same, and I don't know how to do this. We had a treatment facility move in my neighborhood. I thought, yippee, they're right in my backyard, and golly, it's just not working well for me. And there's a lot of guidelines, and I need to fit into their program in order to carry the AA message, and I just feel like I'm complying with their rules in order for me to carry the message. And so, but one thing I've learned today is that it's my responsibility that no matter how the alcoholic ends up in the meeting, that I just need to do my best. So I'll throw that out there. I don't know if it's a question, but we were talking about raising the bottom that another alcoholic hits, but I don't know what the missing link is, and maybe you give me a suggestion. Link, glad to be here. Thanks.
With my hearing deficit, I may not have caught it accurately, but I think you're talking about how to carry the message effectively in an environment that may not be supportive of what you're doing, that may be congruent with what you're doing. I would just offer this, that I mentioned earlier that about designing an effort to fit the environment where it's going. What I mean by that is a lot of times when we're working with an agency or a facility, we get trapped into the notion that we have no influence on what they're doing and are sort of helpless to deal with that thing. In fact, Julia has a copy of it. There's a little 4-step process that we've worked out. Now, here you're talking about carrying a message personally. But if you want to broaden that and talk about how you get a program to work effectively in a place, and I think the same principle would be there. Well, let me take the simple one first with a personal thing. When I go into a facility, all I want to know is who's in there, but more particularly, I want to know what my function is. And my function when I go in there is to be a good example of Alcoholics Anonymous and carry an effective message to whoever's listening. And so I don't get caught up in a lot of details about that, unless there's some bizarre thing out of whack. So the key to me is getting real steady and realistic about what I'm doing. I want to go in there and do what's right the best I know how. And so I just ask God before I go in to help me do just that. And when I clear out all the other stuff and get down to the essence of what I'm about, I don't care where it is. I can carry the message in hell if I get ready to go. And so that, from an individual standpoint, I certainly do that. But I'd like to just expand that just a bit, because a lot of times we really do just sort of throw programs in without a lot of thought to what they do and where they're going to do it and how they're going to do it. It's almost like throwing mud on the wall to see what sticks. And so I made up my mind a long time ago, I will never develop another program in any facility, I don't care what kind it is, without having a substantial meeting with the senior manager of that facility. Not the second banana or the third shift banana. It's going to be the top person in that facility if we're setting up a new program. And the purpose of that meeting is to do one thing. That's to basically learn what that facility is, how they function, how they operate, what kind of latitude you got to do a program in there, if they have an interest in a program. One-sided meeting where you learn about the facility. And then the second step is to meet with the people who are going to do the service and take a look at the facts of that place and say, what kind of program can we fit in? What kind of a program can we develop to fit in what they've told us? The third thing is to write that up and give it to the senior person, and they'll either endorse it by signing it, or if they've got some suggestion for change, which they rarely do. And then the fourth one is to put the program in place. So that sounds like less than what we're used to. Usually what we do is say, we want to have a meeting and say, okay, we'll do it Tuesday night, let's get it on. And then spend the rest of the time pointing fingers about whose fault it is that it's not working. And so what I'm talking about is a way to, we make a mistake by saying it's their facility. Take like corrections, for example, where we do a lot of this. Say it's their facility. Well, it's not their facility. It's a public facility, and we're not street corner thugs. We're responsible citizens trying to offer a service. And so I think there's a very, very respectful platform that we have to operate from. So we don't want to run that facility, but we don't want to just roll over for it. And so when we put a plan together, it's what we think will work in that environment. See, the facility's in charge of running the facility. We're in charge of Alcoholics Anonymous. Our principles laid out traditions are just as important as their rules and regulations or laws. And so I think there's a strong negotiating point that we often ignore. And then we pay the price by confusion and all this kind of stuff. So as an individual, I want to get real prepared to go in and deliver a clear message and get out as an individual. But if I'm going to try to launch a program, then I want to get into some serious negotiation about setting it up in a way that's got a good chance to succeed. Julia can just ask a question, has got a copy of that little form, and it's a very simple thing. It's call it a 4-step process, and it lays it out in pretty clear terms. Probably gave you a lot more answer than you wanted, but it's yeah.
Yeah, my name is Jerry Malcolm.
Hi, Jerry.
First off, thank you. This is not to see you guys. One thing I haven't been around the program a long time, but I do a lot of meetings, and the one thing I notice a lot that I kind of picked up is that 3 words are in the program now, which can't slow it down. Is take your time. Because what I've noticed is that when the people come in the program and they kind of work the steps fairly quickly, they tend to get it a little faster, and it tends to occupy their brain when they're first there, and it's running like crazy. That's the time to get those first 2, whatever, the 4-step done. Can you just discuss a little bit just the difference between the way it used to be and the way it is now, as far as how you guys used to run them through? Because the treatment centers and all that, it's all take your time. And I think what happens, a lot of people did take their time as it went farther. That's the way they thought the next guy should do it. And now, I'll see people 2, 3 years before they even think about 4th and 5th steps in a lot of pain.
You want me to take that? Okay. Well, I look at how long it took Dr. Bob to do his 9th step, and he'd been sober, I think around 5 hours. And I think in the 12 and 12 it said, as far as making amends, we don't want to rush into it. And a lot of people remember that sentence. You know what the next sentence is? We might want to wait several weeks or longer. Several weeks. Okay, so obviously I believe in moving as long as fast as the person can take. And when I sponsor people, it is basically meeting at my house at the time that I said, and we meet for an hour to an hour and a half, and we go through 1 step each week, with the exception of 4, that could take a little bit longer, and 8, and getting 9 organized as to what approach to take on each amend. But I would say the whole thing is 15, 16 weeks, and then it's maintaining, and it is calling with a specific situation so that I can show him another way of looking at it. That is generally all that's required, is that you get stuck and disturbed by something because in your disturbance it's impossible to see it spiritually. And when you see it, and then you just go, oh yeah, and then it just boils down to, I either need to forgive somebody or make an amend. That's the end. There's not anything else to do. You follow what I'm saying? It just, but that's my pace. I don't know how fast you go through.
Let me just underline a couple of things Sandy said. In fact, I'm starting a group on Tuesday coming, and in this one, by just luck of the draw, we are anticipating 16 weeks, and in that one, we're going to do a very focused thing on steps. There are a lot of ways to take people through the program. And because of my travel schedule, I'm never around enough to reliably work one-on-one. And so I've had to opt for going to group. And so I've done a lot of long-term big book workshops. The big thing is getting folk through the program. If I had the luxury of time, I would no longer do it one-on-one, because I think there's an extra value in the group experience. And I like that group experience because that's where we're going to spend the rest of our lives, is in groups. And so I like to get folks sort of conditioned to the fact that the group is a powerful resource. You know, so I lean in that direction. And so to me, the time to take a step is when you get to it, no matter what it is. I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with those kind of production line things that'll often happen in treatment, where it's just sort of scripted out of a quick deal. Sometimes it's effective, but often you have to go back and redo it. So if I'm going to err, I had rather err on the side of too quickly than too slowly, because you can always go back and steady your work. And so I like to just move on, and Dr. Bob's style is fine with me. Yeah, that's a good question.
Very good question.
Yeah.
I'm Betty Graham, I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Betty.
I suddenly feel very shy about asking this, but, Sandy, you were talking about the spirituality of the program. And for many, many years, probably 20 or so, I was always sent to a psychiatrist or a therapist. Okay? At the same time I'm working the steps, I was taught how to work the steps, thank God. I was taught to get on my knees, but I gave my power to this outside enterprise. So guess what? Now all the people that I get to sponsor are all on medication and seeing psychiatrists and therapists and all of this, and I try to emphasize the steps and how it has worked for me. And I don't know, I really feel powerless over this. Maybe God is, He says, well, honey, I gave you this, now what are you going to do with it? I don't know, so I thought I'd mention this. I think it's a problem. I thought I was the only one that was being treated with medication for all those years. And I was told in 2001 that I would have to take the medication for the rest of my life. Well, guess what? I don't have to. So how do I don't know, and then I'm told, be careful. So.
Now, I want to get this. I heard two possible questions. One was about medication in general, but the one I heard also was that your initial experience in AA led you to behave this way, and now you've had a deeper insight, and so your advice now is better than it was earlier. What do you do about that? Or was that a question too?
Well, I don't know how to carefully carry this message, because I'm told you have to not say don't take medication. So I don't. I say work the steps. But I wanted to hear comments from you, because I feel, both of you, or one of you, or whatever, because I feel this has been such a powerful workshop, and I need guidance on how am I supposed to do this. This is a spiritual program, and I finally understand that all I am is
No, I mean, if I got a broken arm, I go get it set. I don't pray that it sets itself. You know what I mean? So there's a role for medicine, and then there's a role for spirituality. But medication, I mean, here we can go back, and here's the old days was that in medical school they taught nothing about alcoholism, and as a result, in the 60s and 50s and maybe 70s, an AA member would go and say to some doctor that, geez, I feel a little anxious when I stand on top of the Empire State Building. And out would come the Valium or the Librium out of knee-jerk reaction, no understanding of alcoholism, and lots of AA members were getting burned. And so individual AA members started speaking out, stop taking that stuff, which is practicing medicine without a license. But it was understandable under the horrible conditions that were going on then. And then now we're getting where there are lots of doctors who are also recovered alcoholics who are very knowledgeable about medications. And that is a great source for people to go to. And if one of them says, this seems to be appropriate, I'm not going to get in the middle of that. That's where I am.
Yeah, I'll mention one thing that this really is a lively issue around the country, and it's one that's got a lot of importance, because if you get off base too much either way, you can do some huge damage. I've seen a number of suicides that were the result of fumbling around with trying to manage medication. And I tell you, as I was a prison administrator for a long time, and had enormous authority. But one authority I would never exercise would be to overrule a medical judgment, because that's suicide to do that, for me to do that. So it's a very heavy kind of an issue. We do get cases sometimes where somebody will get heavy-handed, start dictating things that, my personal notion is, I won't get complicated with, but I'm hanging around with people in the medical world. I learned a term called the clinical imperative. And the clinical imperative simply means that you deal with the difficulty that's most disabling first. Stands to reason. If you got an abscessed tooth, you're not going to be talking about fixing your hair. You're going to get your abscessed tooth taken care of. If you've got a disturbance where medication's required, sometimes that is the clinical imperative. And so what we have to do is yield to the most pressing need. And then when they get stabilized, then it can come to AA. But it's a very critical thing. On the average, just the average walking-in case, most people tend to get slapped with some diagnoses, which may or may not be for real, but they'll get into medication, and it really is a temporary thing. It ought to be a temporary thing. I'm a great believer in a guy from New York, an internist. I love him so much I can't think of his name, and he's prominent in dealing with people who do alcoholism work. And Stanley Getlow is his name.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Stanley Getlow. And he's a brilliant man. He says that he would not make a secondary diagnosis on an alcoholic till he'd been sober at least 2 years, because the false effects are that dramatic. And so a lot of times that's what we're dealing with. And so when I'm working with somebody personally, what I try to do is work with the person to get them to work with their doc to set a realistic gate that they can get off the stuff. And beyond that, I think we're in real jeopardy when we start going beyond that kind of thing. Yeah, so it's a very valid concern.
Thank you.
I'm Elizabeth, an alcoholic.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Thank you both for the workshop, and thank you, Jack. I have a question for Sandy. You were talking about how, and I'm sorry if I'm misquoting you, but you believe that God's will for you is to be involved in every aspect of your life and the details and stuff like that. And my question, I really want to believe that, and I can't, you know. And so I was wondering if you had any suggestions about, or maybe your experience and how you came to that, or how I would believe that, since I want to.
Yes. Because a lot of this is occurred with me after 20, 25 years of, reading what the book clearly says and where I was. And so I'm going, well, how do I get from here to there? And I'm going to tell you, I covered it when I was talking. I decided to. There was never anything more than that. I just, on several different occasions, I just decided to try a day where I imagine myself communicating with my higher power about everything. All right, what should I be doing now? What should I now? Was I getting answers? Like a voice or anything like that? No, I wasn't getting that. But what I was sure of was that I was closer to my intuitive nature than at any other time before that, which is the highest level of thinking that human beings are capable of. Is to, we intuitively know. You remember how sometimes you just go, I don't know why, but I just knew that this, and I just knew. So then I said, well, how could I be there more often? How could I be there more often? I think I'll decide to try and be there more often. Now, the problem is, part of me, anytime I move closer to my higher power, I threaten my ego. So I'm going to veto that. I've never had a decision to make a spiritual progress step without a backlash later on. What are you doing that? Hey, man, that's dangerous in there. You go turn it over. There's no one there to take it. What are you doing? You can't be out there. You better blah, blah, blah. And now, after all these years, I realize it's always going to be there. I decide that, and then there's going to be this thing where you're going to be in trouble. I'm going to, and then it goes away. And then it goes away. So basically, it's always been a decision. Just like everything else is. How do you get to graduate school? You decide to go. The third step made a decision. And so a lot of times, because of my ego, I take back decisions. I got to make them again. And so that's why outside literature sometimes inspires me. I read, oh yeah, look how hard this guy had to work. You read some of these guys, they had to struggle for a year to let go of something. I mean, and then you go, oh, well, then I'm not weird. Okay, so I can, but it always ends up being a decision. Yep.
Hi, my name is Joy.
Hi, Joy.
Just something while I was waiting in line, Tom. You said that you would prefer to work with your people as a group. Working with new, sober, alcohol women as a group doesn't work. You don't like each other. It doesn't work good. My question is a CPT question. I came in the program, got kicked into the program by a supervisor. I'm a professional, I'm an RN. And she didn't want to see me lose my license, so she helped me detox for 3 days in a hotel room and told me to get my butt to AA. That's what I did. It took me a couple months, but I got there. I have had her ask me, now that I'm a sober member in Alcoholics Anonymous for some years, if I wouldn't help other people that she knows in the same way. I have a sponsor tell me, don't you dare, you're jeopardizing somebody else's situation, tell them to go to treatment. I don't know what the guidelines there, and there's also all these professional meetings for recovering nurses. I don't go to those. I go to Alcoholics Anonymous because I'm an alcoholic and I drank with everybody. I didn't drink exclusively. So I have difficulty dealing with these doctors, lawyers, and nurses who don't drink like I drank. I would like to give back to that community, but not exclusively. And at the same time, I don't think me sobering somebody else up the way the supervisor helped me sober up, which worked for me, is my place to do. I don't know what the right answer is. If I could get away with that, I would love to. But I don't know if my ego would get in the way or not. So anything that you have on that, I appreciate. Thank you.
It's one thing about the program, it affords us as much privacy as we want, as much as we need. And there are some people in sensitive positions who simply have to be anonymous. You know, it's just the nature of their profession. And so that's an understandable thing. It's also it's a convenient hiding place too, you know, where you can avoid responsibilities by hiding out. Yeah, one of the things I heard Bill Wilson say one time was that he was talking about anonymity, and he said it was never intended to cause AA to be a furtive hiding place. That the function of AA is to restore us to our rightful place in the world. And so my experience has been that unless it's some remarkably sensitive place, there's rarely trouble if you've got well-established sobriety. It's I think of a thousand examples. Well, I'll give you one that's a kind of a ludicrous sounding thing, but I think it makes a point. I had a friend who was an attorney, and he was walking down the street one day, and he met a fellow attorney who was having a lot of trouble with booze. And so my buddy stopped the guy and chatted with him a minute and said, "Man, why don't you give it up and come on to AA?" And the drunk attorney said, "Oh man, I couldn't do that. Man, if word got out about that, it would ruin me." And my buddy said, "If word got out that I was not in AA, it would ruin me." And so most of the time, if there's not some inordinate demand for anonymity, most of us can do effective work without a lot of fanfare, without a lot of notoriety, and it's usually handled very well. Things have changed, some of them good. I'll give you an example of airline pilots. When I first started encountering airline pilots in AA, those guys were as scared as any human could be, because if they got known as an alcoholic, I don't care if they recovered 20 years, they were fired immediately with no questions. And so I had a buddy, I didn't know what was wrong with him. I didn't know he was a pilot, and I didn't know what was wrong with him. I knew he was flinchy about something, but he didn't have a name. He had initials. His initials were CC. Oh yeah. And yeah, that's right. See how anonymous he was? He was saying But this guy and I were buddies, and one day I asked him, I said, "What is your name?" And he looked all around and he said, "CC." But don't tell anybody. Well, thank God those days are lifted, you know. And today we've got a lot more freedom with that. So I'm tap dancing around that because there's not a real forthright kind of way to do it. I tell you this, I'm about as anonymous as a train wreck. And if there has ever been one iota of injury, embarrassment, or anything else as a result of that, I don't know it. I don't know it. I'll give you one other example on that, because I think it is. Sometimes you grow up with this illusion of the need for anonymity and grossly exaggerated. For a lot of years when I was flying somewhere, people would ask me where I'm going. I'm really always going to AA stuff. Yep. And so they had people to ask me, and I would just sort of be evasive. I wouldn't lie. I'd just sort of avoid the truth. And so I say, "Oh, I'm going to Chicago. What for? Conference? What's it about?" I say, "Oh, it's about alcoholism." "Well, this is not about alcoholism. It's part of the agenda, but it's about recovery. It's about new life." And one day I was flying somewhere, and I thought, why on earth do I do that? That's got nothing to do with anonymity. Absolutely nothing. What it has to do with is either pride or fear. Well, what's anonymous about a steel tube 35,000 feet in the air, for God's sake? And I said, "Man, that's dumb." And I said, "I ain't going to do that anymore." And from that point forward, if anybody wants to know where I'm going, they better be interested. I'll guarantee you they're going to know where I'm going. And they're going to know something. And the important thing is, not only have I never had an awkward situation, I have never had a single person that wasn't more than interested. Practically every one of them's got one in their tree. Every family's got one. I find some that they're the one. I found runaway Alamos. It's amazing what happens, and when you just open up, and that's what this program is about. It's about being able to be free, to be who I am, to just be open and natural and not furtive and guarded. And so, as much as humanly possible, I hope you'll move in that direction, because that's where the liberation is. And I know you got to protect your flanks, but don't sacrifice the farm in the process. So they have all the best.
Thank
Do you?
I'm Ken.
Hi, Ken.
I would imagine that there are a lot, or rather that there is a lot of profit to be had from other organizations, whether it be, say, treatment facilities or what have you. And what kind of conflicts have you run into with regards to AA over treatment facilities? Because what's more important, the bottom dollar or the welfare of an individual? I hear so many people say they've been from one facility to another, and instead of getting caught in what some people call the revolving door of AA, they get caught in the revolving door of a treatment facility. Okay, what can we do to prevent them from even getting that far into the trap of a treatment facility? That's question number one. The other question is, what can we do within our own groups to keep people from getting caught in that trap? One thing my home group does, we have what's called couch duty. Okay.
Call what?
Couch duty.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Where someone who's like real fresh and has no place to stay, they'll stay at one person's house for a few days, and then someone else's house for a few days, and someone else's house for a few days, and we like work with alcohol. It appears to me that the treatment facilities take away that desperation of that one-on-one that you were talking about earlier. With tapering off those who are like real bottom cases. So what can we do about that?
There's a fine line between what we can do and what we ought to do. The treatment facilities are an outside issue, and the conflict I have with them is zero, because I don't have any reason to have any conflict with them. They are an outside entity, and so I don't have any sort of a range war going with those folks. I think what you guys are doing, it sounds a lot like the old-fashioned 12-step work we were doing. Yeah, I suspect that we're going to be doing more and more of that, because the advent of treatment is upon us, and it's getting increasingly difficult to find places for treatment that's affordable. And insurance companies are quitting paying, and so where there used to be treatment centers, there are now hot dog stands. So those who yearn for the good old days are going to get their prayers answered, because those days are coming back. So that's certainly one alternative. I personally don't hesitate to recommend somebody to a treatment center, but only, and my criteria is very simple, if they cannot stay sober for one day, I'll recommend treatment. But if they can stay sober for one day, that's what you need to get going in AA. And so I think there's a great place. Everybody doesn't need treatment. We went through a time when, I swear to God, I felt sorry for alcoholics. They could drink a half a pint, and somebody capture them and have them in treatment. And I thought, boy, that is really, what a cruel thing to do to somebody. And he got started good, and somebody already got him captured. So I think you can overdo it. And so I think I'm lined up pretty solid with what you guys are doing. The reason I say be cautious about how far, when we get into trying to influence an outside entity, we're in the wrong ballpark. But with the drunk that we're working with, whatever we can do to help him get the closest to the scene of the crime, the better. I really like to see somebody be able to get sober the old-fashioned way when they can, but sometimes they can't. So anyway, I said enough about that, I think, Ed, but I commend you for what you guys are doing, for sure. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Matt. I'm powerless over alcohol.
Hi, Matt.
Andy, Tom, I'm just wondering, I need some clarification on the fifth step of admitting God to ourselves and to another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. And, when I was 5 years old, just a little boy, I got the concept of God, my father was never there for me, and I didn't trust. So, I kind of separate. I was separate. I thought I was a rotten kid at 5 years old, and then God wasn't available to me. So, is that separation, me separating myself and becoming self-reliant, the exact nature of my wrongs, or I'm not exactly sure what it means when they say that. The exact nature of our wrongs.
The definition of the exact nature of our wrongs. But what I didn't get the childhood thing. What did that have to do with that?
Well, just like I'm thinking that my alcoholism, the core of my disease is loneliness and low self-esteem, and I just feeling that way, feeling that like God wasn't available to me because I was bad. Where a 5-year-old kid comes up with that, I don't know. But, I'm just trying to figure out, I want to carry this message, and when I sponsor people, and if I ever, hear somebody's fifth step, I wanted to be able to explain to them, what is the exact nature of our wrongs? Is everybody, are all of our, the exact nature, is it the same for everybody, or is it different for different people?
Oh, okay. Well, I think that in the fourth step, we're making a list of our character defects, and that list is the same as in the fifth step. In other words, it's what we have written down as in our inventory, and it's just another way of saying it, the exact nature of our wrongs. What it allows in the fifth step is I have a tendency to do this, and I did it 1,000 times. Here's number 1, here's number 2, here's number 3, here's number 4. I don't have to go through all 1,000. I have covered the nature of it. You follow what I'm saying?
You mean the defect that it? No, I don't, Paul. You mean so the exact nature is you cover like the defect of whatever you're talking about?
It's what we went over in the fourth step.
Okay.
Okay? In other words, I'm going to share that with my higher power and with another person, generally my sponsor. And so whatever I have listed is what I'm sharing. Does that make any sense to you?
No, I guess I'm looking for like the concrete, the exact nature. Like what is the exact nature of our wrongs, or the exact nature of how our character defects flow out of us?
Well, I mean, if I lie to someone, the exact nature is the lie.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like the concrete act.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's exactly what it's. I suppose we're trying to find more in there than there is. Does that make sense to you?
Let me add one other thing that might be an example that in the inventory there's surprising things in there. One of the areas that I found had to do with my relationship with my mother, and she was a wonderful lady, a wonderful loving person. She just overdid it, and so I grew up in a family that was essentially male absent, female dominant, and so when I started looking at the nature of that relationship, it had a mixture of both feelings I had toward her, that was part of the nature of the wrong, The other was that what I deprived her of. You see what I'm talking about? That in one sense, I had a lot of anger toward her, and I felt a lot of guilt and fear that grew up in that matriarchal society. On the other side, what I deprived her of was a son. Yeah. Now she knew she had one somewhere, but most of the time she didn't even know where I was. And so I deprived her probably, excuse me, nothing more important to a mother than her child. And so for most of my life, she didn't know whether I was living or dead or present or anything. And so when you look at the nature of the wrong, that's what starts to come out, was that there was a real damaged relationship there. And the wrong sort of generalized into a general ability to have relationships with people. Kind of revealing that as I started dealing with that, I saw that fundamental to my inability to have relationships went back to that. And so the importance of getting down to the nature of the wrongs is that that's where the freedom comes from. And so just, going to that kind of detail, it helps me to get a real handle on what I'm doing. It also sets up the amends process very neatly, too.
Yeah, I guess when I do fourth and fifth step, I'm actually helping on the fourth. And it's just a technique I developed in the last 15 years. Rather than let somebody complete it all and bring it, we just start and I go, let's just talk about this. Well, I got this down, and then I flesh it out and say, well, do you see that this implication and that implication? And I guess that really is the exact nature, is the ability to see the third dimension of it. Yeah. I just never connected it with those words. I'm glad Tom did today.
Hi, Beth.
Thanks, Jeff, for your service, and thank you so much.
Pull it down a little bit.
My name is Beth. Thanks, Jeff, for your service, and thank you so much. Sandy, I think I heard a tape of yours. Are you a surfer?
No. Well, I could have been lying that day.
You bad.
My other question was, if you had, either one of you had a personal experience with Dr. Bob or Bill, and if you could just share a story about that.
About what?
Your a personal interaction with Bill or Dr. Bob. Just like a little story about.
No. Every year, my friend Hal Marley would say to me, "You want to go to the Bill Wilson dinner with me?" And I would say, "I don't have enough money." And it was just from Washington to New York. And after about 6 years, he said, he's not going to live forever, and you're going to regret that you never met him. Well, he was right, because in 1971, he died, and what would I give to be able to say I shook his hand or had a picture of me and Bill? But I didn't meet, and obviously I didn't meet Dr. Bob. He died in 1950.
Now, I did have the privilege. I did. I went to my first international convention in Toronto in '65. And my primary motivation, I was broke, man. I'm just out of jail. I couldn't afford it. But my primary motivation was that I thought that would be my last chance to see Bill. And for some reason, I wanted to see him. I didn't want to tell him anything. I didn't want to press on him or anything. I just wanted to see him, make sure he's there, And so I went up, and of course I saw him a lot. He was like the Energizer Bunny. He was just all over the place. And then one day we had a traditions meeting, and you can always count on a skinny crowd. And so there's my chance. I went in. There was about probably 35 of us in a room, and so I had a chance to sit down and listen to Bill. Now, we weren't fishing buddies. We were just people in a meeting. But to hear our founder articulate about the program, the thing I mentioned about anonymity a little earlier, I listened to him tell that. I listened to him describe the vision that he had for Alcoholics Anonymous. And one of the things, I mean, it's unforgettable words. It was not Sermon on the Mount, but it came from him. And one of the things he said was that he was talking about that recovery process, and that it's not a hiding place, that the function of AA is restores to our place in the world. And what he said was that if we practice these principles the way they're laid out, there'll come a day when you'll be able to walk the streets of this earth and look any human you meet comfortably in the eye. Man, I was nowhere close to that. But what a promise, really. What a promise. And it was a true promise, because today I don't know of a human that I can meet and not comfortably look them in the eye. And so it was not only a wonderful experience to see the guy. Yeah, it was just to be there, to feel that energy, to appreciate his intelligence, his creative. God, what a creative man. And so, yeah, and I did and value it to this day. Yeah.
Let me just add, this year I went to Stepping Stones for the first time. My sister and I went down, and I'm a big history student of AA, and I misunderstood that part in the history when they got evicted from the townhouse in Brooklyn and their furniture was put out in the street. I assumed that it had been lost. That's how I recorded it in my head when I read that. I didn't know that they got it all back and it went to Stepping Stones. So when we went into the kitchen and the person who was giving the tour said, "This is the table that Bill and Ebby sat at." I said, "This is? It is?" And here's this cheap old Formica white table. And I'm going, "Give me that camera. I want to be there." So I got one in my briefcase, and when I show it to non-alcoholics, they really look weird. Why, I'm so excited about a table.
Now, I never went to Stepping Stones. That's only for circuit speakers. Just 1 minute. Let me tell you one other thing. You're looking for nostalgia. I'll tell you one other thing. In '85, I was invited to speak at the 50th anniversary of AA in Akron. And God knows that's a monumental occasion, a monumental experience. And my first thought was, why on earth would they invite a guy like me? I mean, hell's bells, they could get Nobel laureates, they could get scientists, celebrities, a billionaire. Why would you get some junkyard dog from North Carolina? And that's just the instinctive insecurity about it. Then I thought about it, and I said, well, why wouldn't they? Because this is not about the rich and famous and powerful and brilliant. This is about folks who have been broken and healed. So I got over it and went up, and after I spoke, we went over to Dr. Bob's house. Now, this wasn't planned by anybody. That table reminded me of it. I sat down. Somebody said, would you like a sandwich? I said, yeah, let's do it. So I sat down, if you can picture this, at Dr. Bob's house with his son, Smitty, and his daughter, Sue, and me. Now, I didn't say a word. But I'll tell you what, I was about to dump with that sandwich because, boy, that was overwhelming. Yeah. That's where you see a vision realized, a vision come real. And so that was just a tremendously important occasion for me. Because I don't know, I'm not a hero worshiper or anything like that, but those folks that founded this program, to me, special place.
I had one other special. Yeah. I sat in Chuck Chamberlain's chair overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
You didn't know very
Anyway, I mean, that was like, oh my God.
And before our next question, I just want to remind everybody we have about 10 minutes. So in case there's anyone who has kind of that last, if you will, burning question for our two panelists, I want to make sure that you have time to stand up and ask that question. Please go ahead.
Hi.
Well, Thomas, thank you for your informative workshop. It was really good to see you and get the information that you gave. I did a lot of writing. questions about H9 meetings. And
What?
one of the questions is,
What kind of meetings?
when you take a meeting into an institute,
Okay.
hospitals and institutes.
Yeah, okay.
I would want to add a woman's
Right.
treatment facility. And I guess, I just wanted some information on guidelines as to, types of meetings, should be specific meetings, if there should be a certain focus, if you should, be trying to teach something, and if so, what, a format, or, I know you bring in speakers, but you like to try to do other things also. Basically, that's it. For that part, then I have something else to ask.
And about different types of meetings that.
Kind of like what would be a guideline or structure to do something like that.
I tell you what, in shaping a program for a place, I mentioned about going in and meeting with the people, finding out how the place works. The other thing I want to know is who's in there. Now, I don't mean personal information, but I want to know who are the folks that are in that place. How long are they going to be there? What are their circumstances? I want a picture of that population. And, I want to know how long they're going to be staying, because when you plan a program, it has to fit the environment it's going to work in. And that's why I don't like planning a program and then going trying to stick it in somewhere. The program has to be designed to meet the needs of that particular group. And about different types of meetings that.
Kind of like what would be a guideline or structure to do something like that.
I tell you what, in shaping a program for a place, I mentioned about going in and meeting with the people, finding out how the place works. The other thing I want to know is who's in there. Now, I don't mean personal information, but I want to know who are the folks that are in that place. How long are they going to be there? What are their circumstances? I want a picture of that population. And, I want to know how long they're going to be staying, because when you plan a program, it has to fit the environment it's going to work in. And that's why I don't like planning a program and then going trying to stick it in somewhere. The program has to be designed to meet the needs of that particular group. I'll give you a real quick little example. We were going to do a program in a local jail, and so we went over and met with the sheriff and the leaders of that thing, and had them tell us about the place. Well, it turned out what we were talking about was a hot cot situation, by and large. They had a few folks that stayed around, but most of them were just sort of in and out like a bus station. Well, it was pretty clear when we got through, we were not going to do an AA meeting at all. That an AA meeting would have been a joke, because they couldn't even get there long enough to learn how to say the prayer, And so what we wound up doing was putting together an AA information session. And we wound up with, I think, 7 topics or something of really relevant information that a guy needed to go. Our objective for that was to create enough interest that they would go to one meeting when they got out. That was realistic for that situation. So, I've seen people try to do big book studies in a similar setting. And my God, that's ludicrous. And so when I'm doing a program, that's what I want to do, is make sure the program fits the needs of the group that you're dealing with, and make it fit that environment. Yeah. What was the other one?
Someone raised a question about having a round robin meeting, and I was wondering if that was something that you were familiar with, and if so, what is that?
So, round robin. That's basically where you get together and folks from around an area and I hope eat. Don't usually eat those things. I'm not sure about that. I think they serve a great purpose. I think eating meetings serve a good purpose, and not just eat. It's important to share gifts, and that's what you do at eat meeting, to share gifts. And so I think anything like that nurtures that spiritual bond that we've got. Yeah, and I think that's what a round robin does. That it sort of breaks down some of the distance between folk, gets unity, you address unity kinds of things, get to know your neighbor. It makes it a lot easier to line up speakers. Because a lot of times when I go there, man, I'm looking for talent. I'm gonna get me some speakers when I go there. And so I think they serve a great purpose, and all it takes is just a little communication around a certain circle. Yeah, I think they're a great thing, and fairly easy to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I heard, I think it was Peggy on a tape say that there was a period when she was new in sobriety, the big book was not used, and that a lot of the recovery was based on the 24-hour-a-day book. But she never explained why. And I've always been curious, like, is that your understanding too? And if it is, what happened? Why did it disappear, and how did it come back into existence again with people taking it seriously and using it as a tool?
Let me take one whack at this, Sandy might. That is right. And I came in at a point when the big book, we love to talk about it. You talk about the book all the time, but it wasn't used very much. Yeah. And the 24-hour day book was, it wasn't even looked at as a bootleg piece of material like it is now. All they were doing was making up for our absence of it. It took us, 40 years to print one. And so it served a really useful tool. It was outside literature, but it was used. And part of it, the reason it fit in, now it's just personal bias, but part of the reason it fit in was, as Sandy described this earlier, we were moving out of a fairly religiosity-oriented program. In our early days, we still were pretty much, right down the line, a lot of old-fashioned religion permeated AA. And so the 24-hour day book fit in very comfortably. And some groups still use it to this day, and in preference to other materials. So I don't know why, but it was so popular, it made a great tool for conducting meetings. You see a lot of meetings that were used. A lot of people used it for the daily deal, just like it's intended. So it was a very, very popular thing. Big book wasn't featured much. And you would hear people talk about it. All you got to do is look at the sales. Look at the sales and you can track it, the answer to your question. It wasn't heavily marketed in the program, wasn't heavily used. There was no such things as big book workshops. There was no such thing as big book studies. It was just something that was there, mostly used as a doorstop. And when you look, the first million, I can't remember this precisely, but it took us something like 30 years or so to sell 1 million books, no more than that. Does anybody know right off that? A long time. 35, huh? 35? I can't quite hear it, Chris.
40 years, took 40 years.
40 years.
Nixon
All right,
got the
40
first
years.
one.
It'd take an old person to know that. I took 40 years to sell 1 million. We gave out our 25 millionth copy at the International. The biggest boon to the sale of big books was treatment. At one time, I wish it weren't so, but it's so. At one time, the largest consumer of AA material, including the big book, was the Hazelden Corporation. And so what really led to the rocketing sales of big books was treatment. And they referred to the big book as the $30,000 book. And I don't know, it's a kind of an interesting history, but it's what it does. It tracks the development of the program.
Yeah, I got sober with Peggy. She's 10 months ahead of me, but in Washington, D.C., and I still read the 24-hour day book every day. But I never bring it to an AA meeting or anything like that. And the old-timers in D.C. then talked about putting the plug in the jug and going to meetings. Put the plug in the jug and go to meetings. Put the plug in the jug. So I had 5 years, hadn't done any step work. And then it all started, and then the transformation took place, and went on inside, and you just start radiating, and that's what I believe is the most important thing to pass on.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Don Bennett, alcoholic. And I'm going to mention past delegate panel 53, area 19, Chicago, because this question, and this is probably a good place to end, and I'm pretty sure Tom alluded to this morning, and it is a fact that hardly anyone ever talks about or mentions, but I know Tom talks about it, and I would not be surprised if Sandy talks about it also, but almost everyone that comes to Alcoholics Anonymous comes because of the work of one of the service committees of the General Service Conference. So I would just like you to comment on that, Tom, and Sandy.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very, very accurate statement. If you think about where alcoholics come from, if you look at one of the charts, it'll tell you where they come from. Every door is one where we do service, like correctional facilities. You know, you got a lot of people who come into AA out of correctional facility. Treatment facility has been the greatest producer for a long time. Employee assistance programs have always been a heavy producer of AA members. At one time, they had 47% of our new members were coming out of employee assistance. So he's 100% right. If you look at where our service committees are, it's the places where we get people from. And we pretty well covered a community with those things too, by the way. But that's probably no accident. That I don't know if it's a cart for a horse or what, but it is a fact. And when you consider that there's so much lacking in terms of full implementation, think about what a difference we could make with real crackerjack committees working, fostering relationships. With an awful lot of people, when they're dealing with a drunk, the best they know how to do is that. And so we can make a difference in that. And I sure hope that you guys will give serious thought to ways to foster the development of those things further. Yeah, that's a good point, Don, very much.
Tom?